I recently had a chance to host members of our customer value community at a meetup in London. It was a really great event co-hosted by our good friend Graham Hawkins over at Sales Tribe. And it was an especially interesting event because it combined two adjacent but really different groups of individuals inside a commercial organization. So on the one hand, we had sales enablement leaders, sales operations, sales managers, and sales leaders. And then on the other hand, we had members of the value profession or the value community. So VPs, directors of value management, value engineering, value realization. And it was a great event, and everyone had a really great chance to network and get to know each other. But it was particularly interesting towards the end of the event. A friend of mine who's a well-known sales podcaster came up to me and kind of pulled me aside, and he said, "Brent, I've got a question." I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Who are all these value people, and what in the world is value management?" And it's a great question because this is actually a function or a sub-function inside the commercial organization that people are only just now beginning to really hear of, particularly those individuals or professionals outside of software as a service or the SaaS platform industry where value management really got its start. So what is value management? Well, at its kind of its core, value management as a discipline has been around for decades. It is simply the process by which a supplier organization, usually a sales team, will sit down with a customer and map out in some sort of business case or calculation the likely value that customers will get from that solution or the demonstrated value that customers have gotten from that particular solution. And of course, as solutions over the years have become more complex with additional products and service wraparounds and recurring revenue models and long-term contracts and you name it, those calculations have in fact become quite complex. Thus, Interstage Left Value Management is a specialist team to help the sales organization, or for that matter, the customer success organization, build those calculations and sometimes even deliver those calculations with customers. So this is the world that we live in at Ecosystems. It's a world that we've lived in for 20 years, in many ways have created, or at least been part of the creation of this sub-profession. But that said, here's how we think about it at Ecosystems. Value management really, at its heart and soul, isn't actually just a calculation. In fact, it can't just be a calculation. It really has to be a journey. And it's a journey that you go on with your customer over time, collaboratively. All right, so what does all that mean? Well, if you think about it, if you simply put a value management, a value calculation in front of your customer, again, whether it's part of a pre-sale or maybe it's part of a customer success renewal conversation or a growth conversation, whatever it might be, it turns out, and we all kind of know from practical experience, it's very hard for your customers to appreciate whether or not that calculation is accurate or whether it's believable or whether it's meaningful to them if they haven't stopped and asked some bigger questions first. So rather than starting with this question of how do we calculate the value of this collaboration, what we have found at Ecosystems is it's more effective by far to start with a much broader question, a higher level, a higher altitude question of what are you even trying to do in the first place, and build down from there. So really, a value conversation has kind of 4 or 5, probably 5 dimensions to it. So number one is where many value conversations don't start but should, and that is around what is the customer's strategic objectives. Not here's a calculator and what are the fields in that calculator and what's my ROI, but what are you even trying to do in the first place? And then from strategic objectives, we can move down to practical tactics. So if those are your 1 or 2 top strategic objectives that you agree on that you need to get done, what are the steps that you're going to take to actually realize those objectives, to bring those objectives to fruition? And once we figure out what those practical tactics are, then we can determine, okay, what are the principal metrics we're going to use to measure progress against those tactics? So are we doing well or not? So what are the actual dimensions that we're going to measure to figure out whether or not we're making progress? And then fourth, once we figure out the metrics, what are the specific targets for those metrics that will determine whether or not we've succeeded? So what's the threshold of success, if you will, and what are those targets in as objective a sense as possible so that we can all agree that, yes, we did succeed, or maybe no, we came up short. And then finally, number 5, what's the actual established timeline against which we are working to determine whether or not we've realized those targets against those metrics to bring those tactics to fruition to help us achieve our objectives. And you kind of get the idea. And that, I think, is really value management at its core, is at that journey of putting all of that together and documenting it both pre-sale and post-sale to determine whether or not that collaboration between you and your customer organization have succeeded. Now, that said, it becomes actually far more fraught and more complicated in real life, doesn't it? Because at the end of the day, it's not just one stakeholder that has to agree to those 5 dimensions of objectives, tactics, metrics, targets, and timelines, but it's actually multiple stakeholders. And so there's this moment, actually it's an ongoing series of moments, where the customer stakeholders have to align around those 5 dimensions and agree that those, in fact, are that they're locked in on. Those are the objectives we all agree on. Those are the tactics we believe are the best tactics to help us achieve those objectives. Those are the right metrics that we all agree are we're going to use to measure those progress against those tactics, and so on. And so it begs this really important question of who needs to agree. And many times, of course, customers themselves don't fully know or don't fully appreciate who all inside their own organization needs to be involved in that particular calculation or in that particular process. And I think that's where so much of the work I've talked about in previous breakdowns around frame making and around confidence creation becomes so important, because one of the roles that we can play as a supplier and part of our value management team is by providing recommendations of who needs to be involved in establishing those 5 answers to those 5 questions. And then there's this really interesting question of when does that need to be when does that all need to happen? So right now, so much of what happens in sales and I suppose in the value community is focused on making sure that that conversation happens as part of a renewal conversation in sort of the customer success space after the deal is done, to make sure that actually this was worthwhile and we should keep on keeping on, or maybe even grow over time. But I think where this gets really interesting, the way we like to think about it at Ecosystems, is what if we think about this as a multi-step journey that starts way up at the top of the funnel in customers learning on their own through digital channels. And so what if customers could actually have that conversation with themselves, that is with their colleagues, around objectives and tactics and metrics and targets and timelines in a digital format that is being prompted, that is being guided by tools that you've provided them through digital channels that can then transfer into an ongoing conversation through sales and sales leadership and sales reps, supported maybe by a value team if things get particularly complex and complicated, which then gets handed off to a customer success conversation so that the value realized is consistent with the value promised prior to the deal. So it's the same conversation across these different teams in your organization and across these different stakeholders inside the customer organization and across these different dimensions of objectives, tactics, metrics, KPIs, and targets. And then we have to figure out, all right, given the fact that we live in the real world and things change over time, how can we adapt that entire body of work, all of those agreements that were made, to fit with the current context as the reality on the ground shifts, either post-sale, during sale, or post-sale, and particularly in an ongoing relationship over time. That entire dynamic, all of those people and all of those questions all put together, that's how we think about value management in ecosystems. And if I may, I think that's how we all should be thinking about value management in any commercial organization. And it begs a really interesting question. What is the infrastructure? What is the set of tools? What is the technology on top of which you are running that conversation, not for your customer, but with your customer over time, so you can capture that knowledge and that you can use it to have better conversations going forward, that you can benchmark with other experiences and other companies on similar journeys, and that you can essentially go to your customer with a far better understanding of how value is measured in companies like theirs and a far greater ability to guide, to prompt that conversation around dimensions that those customers may not have thought of altogether. So what is value management? Frankly, it's a lot. And it's all these kinds of things that we all should be doing already. And many of us would say we are, but often it's on a spreadsheet and a cost calculator, or it's happening in one part of the sale, but not in the post-sale, or vice versa. This is an ongoing collaborative business relationship that we're establishing with our customers around what are you trying to do, how will you know when you get there, and what are we going to do going forward given the fact that reality has changed. And that is powerful stuff. And that is ultimately how you build a strategic relationship with your customer through value management. Whether you have a value management team or not, this is the kind of activity that we support at Ecosystems, and is a kind of activity that needs to be going on in every organization around the world. I think we'd all agree. So watch this space. Value management today feels a little bit like customer success 8 years ago, and we'll see where we are in a couple of years. But this is the kind of discipline we all need to be building.